It is history in the making. President Obama is about to land in Cuba.
Good morning, David.
Good morning, Robin. History made here in Cuba. Not since Calvin Coolidge has a U.S. president visited Cuba. But as you point out, this visit does not come without controversy.
Nothing has changed in Cuba. If anything else, though political prisoners were released, another bunch was arrested. Basically, you are either with Fidel or you're not. And if you are with him, it's fine. You don't have to worry. You just go along and things are okay. But if you're not, and if you're a little different, then you got problems. Then you're isolated. The issue with me is that I do believe there's a dictatorship. Not everyone thinks that, but to me, when you have one person running the country until he gets sick and decides that he's not going to run anymore, which means he was running the country from 1959 to about 2004, the longest running ruler in the world during our time. To me, that means there's a dictator. I think the corruption in the regime, I think the inability to manage things well, because since Fidel had to approve everything that everyone did and people were afraid to take chances, ruined the economy, bad management, which no one could criticize. Then all the money that was coming in from abroad, instead of putting that money to the use of people, it was put into the army. So then the army, the Cuban army, went to fight in Israel, went to fight in Africa, went to fight in Latin America as special agents. So that money was dispersed rather than being used to build the infrastructure of the country. Things like when you graduate from college, the good thing is you don't have to worry about the job, because the government says, well, here's a job for you. But the bad thing is that you don't choose a job. You're just given the job, and if you don't take it, then people don't take kindly to that. Do I think there was a need for a revolution? I think there was a need for a revolution, but the revolution took a different direction because it became Castro's project rather than the Cuban people revolution. Fidel Castro had resigned in 1965 or 1966. Most people will agree and say he did great, he was a hero, but he could not let go of power.
My name is Michelle Chase. I'm an assistant professor here in the Humanities Division at Bloomfield. I teach world history, Latin American and Caribbean history, intro to Latin American and Caribbean studies, and a few other things. It'll have a huge symbolic effect in Cuba. I mean, I think almost all Cubans welcome more attention from the US government, more diplomacy, more engagement with the American government. I think Obama is going to be seen as something of a hero within Cuba for the fact that he really was the one who initiated this and sought out ways to transform that relationship.
My father tried to remain not involved in politics, but the revolutionary fervor of the era demanded that you were either with the revolution or against it. So he was pressured and he was criticized for not wanting to support the revolution. No. Eventually he resigned from his position in the government. He was still working for the government. The moment you resigned, then it's very clear that you are not for the revolution. So he was labeled a gusano, a worm, and he was harassed. It was in September of 1964, September 13th. My father received a telegram from the government saying, we give you permission to leave. The day after that, the Secret Service came to the house and they confiscated the house. If you didn't have a bag ready with your clothes, you would have to leave your clothes behind. And they pulled the seal on the door, which made it illegal for anyone to get into the house. Once you leave Cuba, whatever you have belongs to the government. The Secret Service came, and then we stayed with friends who lived down the block. We spent the 2 weeks with them. My father told me, you cannot tell anyone we're leaving Cuba. And what you do is you go through a waiting area that's called in Spanish a pecera, a fishbowl, because you're not allowed to talk. So we went through that area, and you sit there and you wait till the plane is ready to go. You are not allowed to take anything out with you, just 3 changes of clothing. So as you go through, the militiamen or the Secret Service, they open your bag, and if it exceeds what you're supposed to take, they keep it, and it goes to the government. They can also search your body to make sure that you're not taking any money, any jewelry. I had a little ring, and the guy took it because I wasn't allowed to take that. And then we were waiting, and nothing was happening. And eventually the militia guy got on the microphone and said, the plane's going to leave, but we have so many Russian technicians, I don't remember how many, that need to go on this flight. So this is overbooked, so some of you are not going to be able to go. So what they did was they took the name of all the people and then cut them into little pieces, put them into a beret, and then they took out the name and they called your name, and if your name was called, then you had to, you were not leaving. You could leave later, but that was very difficult to do. So I remember my father sitting with his legs spread out, his elbows on his knee, his hands cupped, and his face put into a praying that we would be able to leave. Because if we had not left, we didn't have a house to go back to. A few months ago, when I was in Professor Che's class in October, and students asked me that, and I said, no, I'm not going to go back. But I have changed. I have a friend who's Russian. He's an artist, goes back many times, and he's finally persuaded me to go back. I want to go back with my son and my daughter. I'm not going to go back to my neighborhood, but recently I met a professor from Cuba, and we were socializing. I have a friend who's a professor at Rosines College, and he goes to Cuba a lot, so he invited one of those professors to be with him for about a week. So we met in Pennsylvania. And when I told him where I lived, he told me that he thinks that neighborhood was torn down. My father traveled through Cuba a lot, so I want to go back to those places, not my home. There are some very beautiful places. There's Santiago, which is where I spend all my summers with my grandmother in Santiago. It's a very pretty city on the hill. So I want to go to Santiago. The countryside it's beautiful, so I want to go to the countryside. I want to go. There are areas that have very famous valleys, so I want to do that. My wife left very young, so she doesn't know Cuba. So I want to take her back to those places. There's one of the most beautiful beaches in the world, and now because I'm Cuban, this is what you'll find when you Google it. It's called Varadero. So I want to go to Varadero. I want to go back to Old Havana and walk around in Old Havana. I want to go sailing around the island, so I will plug in some of the museums, the library, maybe the school that I went to. I'm not sure about that, but definitely the National Library and the museum. So those are the places that I will go back. I also told myself, if I'm not going back because of Fidel and Raul, I'm letting them control my life once again. And they're old people. I'm old. They're much older than I. I can't let that anymore. So I will go back, and it might be next year.